Hello, good evening. Welcome to World Monuments Fund. My name is Yanis Avramidis. I'm a program manager here, and it's a great pleasure to see such a big turnout for tonight's event. I was looking at the forecast yesterday, and it said soaking rain. But you wouldn't know it from seeing this crowd. So, for anyone who hasn't been here before, World Monuments Fund is the leading private organization that's dedicated to saving the world's most treasured places. And every 2 years, we issue the World Monuments Watch, which is a call to action for heritage places around the globe that are at risk from the forces of nature and from the impact of social, political, and economic change. So tonight's topic is the underwater city of Pavlopetri in Greece, which is included on the 2016 World Monuments Watch. The 2016 watch contains 50 sites in 36 countries, and Pavlopetri went right at the top of every news article back when the watch was announced in October. And I can also tell you that since we received more than 180 nominations for this cycle of the watch, it was a site that really captivated many of us at WMF in the course of our review process, because as you'll hear tonight, it's an absolutely fascinating place, and there are many different circumstances right now that are working both for and against it. But I'm not going to give any spoilers. I'll just introduce our two speakers. Tonight we have the honor of hearing from the person who first discovered the site, Dr. Nick Fleming. Dr. Fleming is a marine archaeologist who has been researching the effects of earthquakes and of the changing global sea level on coastal archaeological sites for more than 50 years. He learned to dive in the Royal Marines during military service, and then he applied those underwater working skills to research while he was at Cambridge University. And in 1967, he discovered the underwater ruins of the Bronze Age city of Pavlopetri during a survey of the course of the Peloponnese, and that's a story that I look forward to hearing more about tonight. He has dived in more than 400 submerged coastal ruins and underwater cities around the Mediterranean, and he's currently coordinating research on submerged prehistoric sites in European seas that range in ages from 5,000 to 350,000 years old. And apart from marine archaeology, his other work has been on the development of operational oceanographic services and forecasting as part of the Global Ocean Observing System. And then after Dr. Fleming's presentation, we are also going to hear from Dr. Cheryl Beanard, who is the founder of the Alliance for the Restoration of Cultural Heritage, or ARCH, and it was the Greek... It was the Greek chapter of ARCH that brought Pavlopetri to our attention by nominating the site to the World Monuments Watch. And so tonight we're also going to hear about their ongoing efforts to protect the site. Dr. Beanard holds degrees from the American University of Beirut and the University of Vienna. And after teaching at the University of Vienna, she was appointed research director at the Boltzmann Institute, which is a political think tank. And then later she moved to the US, and she became a senior analyst and program director at the RAND Corporation in its National Security Research Division. Dr. Beanard then decided to apply the skills of strategic analysis to heritage protection when she became tired of witnessing the wanton destruction of culture and was shocked into action by the destruction of the Bamiyan Buddhas in Afghanistan. And along with a few colleagues, she founded ARCH, which is headquartered in Washington, D.C., and is now active in Afghanistan, Iraq, Cuba, Syria, and, of course, Greece. So Dr. Fleming and Dr. Beanard will talk for around 40 minutes, and that's total, not each. And at the end, there will be some time for questions and answers from the audience, and afterwards, there will be a reception right here at the back of the room. And then also, lastly, tonight's event is being taped. So if you know of anyone who should have been here and couldn't make it, just please look for the recording on our website in the next few weeks. So that is all for me, and please enjoy tonight's lecture.
Ladies and gentlemen, representatives of the World Monuments Fund and representatives of the Alliance for the Restoration of Cultural Heritage, I'm honoured to be invited to talk to you this evening. Pavlopetri is the oldest complete town ever found underwater. The settlement contains both Neolithic and Bronze Age material, that's say from 3,000 to before 5,000 years old. And the town flourished principally in that period, between 3,000 and 5,000 years ago. After that, it sank into the sea as a combination of both earthquakes and sea level rise. And the sea, in a sense, has protected it for the last 3,000 or 4,000 years until now. It's a unique archaeological remain and desperately requires protection. I found the ruins on the seafloor in 1967 and have helped to organise a large number of projects and trips here that many people have been involved. And I should stress also that Professor Jay Kleinberg, my wife, accompanies some of these projects and has given me many ideas about history of towns and archaeology and social structures, which scientists find very difficult to understand. I thank all the people who've taken part in these projects, but I can't possibly go through them all step by step and make individual thanks. Pavlopetri is situated in the extreme southern tip of the Peloponnese, and it's just opposite the big island of Elafonisos. This name Elafonisos is going to come up quite often, so please remember that. The typical foundations of the walls are not square blocks like the Parthenon or the Empire State Building. They're all scattered irregular blocks like that, but you can see the walls very, very clearly. That's our daughter, Kirsten, who's a trained architect and a trained working diver. Very useful. The aerial shot, top left is the mainland of the Peloponnese, bottom right is Elafonisos Island, Pavlopetri Island, which of course is the modern name. We don't know what the city was really called. And the ancient ruins are all in the triangle between the island and the big sand spit. You can see a sort of rocky spit coming out under the water. And up here somewhere, there, you can see dark lines coming down, which are the beach rock. That's another word that'll come up. It's fossil beaches, and that's extremely important. And the mainland and Elafonisos were joined together when the town was occupied, and then subsequently the isthmus between the mainland and Elafonisos flooded, and the city went underwater. The first map was made in 1968, the year after I found it, with a project team from the University of Cambridge. They made a wonderful publication in 1969, which is in front here. Anyone can come and look at it afterwards. And then everybody forgot about it. I went back in 2007 and found that, to my surprise, the ruins looking in quite good condition. They were still there. They were looking a bit battered, and all the tombs had been broken open. And the most overriding problem was that you could see that the development of tarmac roads, hotels, car parks, and so on meant that modern civilization, so-called, had encroached on this very close to the site. So we went back in 2008 with John Henderson, who's on the left there, and me waving my arms about in a dramatic way, and we're planning the reconnaissance. We got permission in 2009 for a 5-year project led by John Henderson. Now, the walls underwater, as I mentioned, are not square blocks laid neatly, and we have to try and interpret the town from the foundations. Here you can see a very thick wall. It's about 5 or 6 feet thick, with 2 faces of stone. The marks on the pole, forgive me, are in centimetres, 25 centimetres. But you can see massive blocks like that, with an infill of smaller stones and rubble and clay. You could support a building of 2 or even 3 stories, with the upper stories being in timber and wattle. The earliest stage of building, even older, perhaps in the Neolithic, more than 5,000 years old, would have been like this. And this is a wall from near Pavlopetri at a place called Plitra, which has never been mapped. If anybody wants a PhD, have a go for it. This is Pavlopetri itself, and you can see that the rectangular nature of the rooms is quite clear. In 1968, when they did the survey there, the Cambridge team, they identified 15 separate houses with between 6 and 10 rooms per house. So it's quite an urban, and that was just part of the town. It's about 24 acres of ruins underwater. A point to notice here is that the walls have got this very strange growth on them, which is actually boring into the rock. And if we go back one slide, you can see that that's relatively clean. So that there's something changing in the chemistry of the water. And again, this is a 1967 picture, one of the Kiss tombs, and you can see they're quite clean. The black furry things are sea urchins, and they actually graze on the organics growing on the stone and effectively keep it clean. So there's been a complete change in the biology of what is living on the site. By 2011, we had permission to excavate the site, as well as apply a whole lot of modern electronic systems to get a much better map, actually mapping it stone by stone so that you can identify every building and everything that changes from year to year. And here you can see the divers erecting a steel frame over a large pithos jar and then excavating it with a mud pump. I did mention that you have to remember beach rock. This stuff forms in warm climates, typical of the southeast Mediterranean, but in many other tropical places. And it's a completely natural concretion of beach sand, shell fragments and chemicals from seashells and sunlight. It's catalyzed by sunlight, and it just looks like concrete. And in an area with very little tide, like the Mediterranean, just about 6 inches of tide, you get these sort of annual growth rings of concrete, looking like concrete along the beach. And believe you me, half the stories about underwater ruins that you see in the popular press are divers or fishermen who found this stuff underwater and think that it's artificial. It's a terribly confusing issue, but it is very useful to geologists because it does tell you about the ancient sea level. Okay, helicopter view. Pavlopetri Island is in the background, 3 strips of submerged beach rock. So you can see that the coastline sank in steps, perhaps 3, 4, 5 steps, and beach rock formed at each stage every 1,000 years or so. The divers went down to sample the beach rock, to get samples of the rock for their date and composition. And we ran a robot vehicle over the beach rock, taking stereophotogrammetric pictures from which one could reconstruct the 3 strips of beach rock and then date them and show the rate of subsidence. The other techniques that John Henderson pioneered, firstly, was using the Mesotech sector scanning sonar. The device hanging from the tripod sends out a sonar beam at 750,000 cycles per second and rotates in little steps of 1 degree at a time, rather like the radar in an airport, and builds up a complete acoustic image of the seabed, from which you can get a rough map. It's not very, very detailed, but it tells you all the outlines of the main buildings. The other technique that we used, or John brought in, was an autonomous underwater vehicle developed by Oscar Pizarro from the University of Sydney. And this machine is able to travel in dead straight lines controlled by GPS and take overlapping stereo pairs. There's some numbers here. Here we go. It's an IVA 2 autonomous underwater vehicle. It was able to take 300,000 stereo pairs in 5 days. And that means that they were overlapping both along the track, and the tracks were so close together that you had stereo overlap from track to track. That produced a complete image of the city at a scale of 1 to 1. Every block, every sea urchin, every stone could be zoomed in and looked at, rather like a Google street map. The 24 acres of site was surveyed in 5 days. They were actually done at night. If anybody wants to understand why, please ask me afterwards. There isn't time to explain that. The AUV stores 640 gigabytes of data, and they took 1.5 terabytes of data in the course of the survey. There it is, off to make its map. When we were off the site, our techniques were slightly more primitive, simply using a fishing boat with an echo sounder and GPS. That's to get the mapping of the terrain all around outside the city. This is the map from 2009. I can't show the more modern ones, I'm afraid, because they're not published yet, and it's entirely up to the Greek Ephorate for Underwater Archaeology and the University of Nottingham before the latest maps are published. But this one is published, and I can give you the reference, and there's an article here if you want to see it. But you can see the main street running diagonally. Probably the town was completely symmetrical, so that the blank areas are simply buildings that are under the sand or have been broken up to the point that we can't identify them now. People always think of cities underwater going down in one great big sort of Hollywood bang with earthquakes and volcanoes. And okay, that's fun. I mean, like Akrotiri and so on the island of Thera. But actually, I think it's very human to think of the site going down in small steps and just sort of hour by hour sinking into the water. There are still questions that we need to solve about Pavlopetri. A lot of them are very specific archaeological and cultural things, but I'm going to look at two things. When did the isthmus between Elefonisos and the mainland go underwater? And how close could you build the town to the water? Because if you've got houses which are made out of stones with no cement, you can't have them risk being hit by waves 5 or 10 feet high. First thing is the isthmus. All the academic literature, the Admiralty pilot, the chart and guides for sailors in the area say that you could walk across the isthmus in 1670. So 230 years ago, they say that the area between the mainland and the big island was dry. If that was the case, it would appear that it has sunk about 15 or 20 feet in the last 300 years, which doesn't fit the archaeology, it doesn't fit the beach rock, it doesn't fit the local geology and geophysics. So the question is, what's wrong with this story about being able to walk across the strait in 1670? I tracked the academic literature back to the earliest published book in 1893, printing the diary of this gentleman, the Reverend John Covell. It's a hilarious story. If anybody wants to look it up, it's wonderful. The sailors from a British fleet landed on the southern shore of Elefonisos after a bad storm, hoping to get water and food and just to stretch their legs and get refreshed. They were attacked by bandits, and the captain had warned them of this. A huge fight broke out with swords flashing and pistols firing all over the hillside. Covell draws this perspective drawing of the hill with letters on it relating to the text, so you can follow the whole drama in detail. And eventually, the bandits made off with 4 sailors bound up. And this is the critical point. Captain Wild, being all this while on board and observing all which had happened, thought we were not strong enough, and therefore firing a great shot over us, called us back. And some time after came all his soldiers on shore, well armed, and then Mr. Day, his lieutenant, a brave gentleman, marshalled us all and put us in order, and away he led us up the mountain. But when we came to Point D is the top of the mountain, we found we were come too late. He doesn't cross his T's. For all the rogues had crossed the water in their, can you see, boots or boats? Okay? And were just landing on the mainland. And with our glasses, binoculars, we could discover our poor captives, that's the 4 sailors who've been captured, bound, amongst them bound. The lieutenant was earnest, enthusiastic, for bringing our boats or boots about and going after them, the rogues, for they appeared in all much less than 100 men. Our captains, though all brave men, were utterly against this. So they abandoned the 4 sailors, and the story goes on and on. I promise you it's funny. They turned up and ransomed in a Turkish galley in Smyrna 4 years later and were rescued and wanted their back pay from the Royal Navy. But the key point is this word boots. The text there, that phrase, the rogues had crossed the water in their boats, got into the printed text as boots. That is the whole story for how the isthmus was fordable in 1670. It's not true. The isthmus was probably 8 or 10 feet deep in 1670. I haven't published this yet, but I've worked on it with some Greek geologists, and we're looking for a journal of humorous archaeology, but I don't think there is one. If anybody, honestly, you have to read the original. Okay, how close could the waves get to a town? Chrysanthi Galou found this amazing picture. That's more or less what Neapolis looked like. It's a little town about 5 kilometers away. And you can see the jetty sticking out. This picture from 1935, there's the jetty, and waves breaking over the jetty about 15 feet high. Yeah, 12 to 15 feet high, 4 to 5 meters. Now, a wave like that would obliterate Pavlopetri in one night. So clearly there's something wrong. We made a computer model of the wave action in the area. The Elefonisos Island is the big bit sticking out on the left, and it's joined to the mainland. Pavlopetri is in the corner where it's dark blue. The color scale, dark blue means waves a few inches high, dark red means they're 30 feet high. So the computer model shows that if you have a storm from the southwest, Pavlopetri is in that dark blue wave shadow where the waves are just a few centimeters high, and similarly if it's a storm from the southeast. Neapolis, if you look at it, is in a dead straight line with that orangey yellow. If you look on the scale, it's 5 meters, which is exactly what that big wave was. So every 50 to 100 years, you could get a wave of 15 feet, but it wouldn't strike Pavlopetri. Summary of work in progress, things that we know and don't know and want to work on. I've put down there, the isthmus was not dry land. The sand movement damaging the site, erosion and boring sponges. Just finishing on the next steps, what can we do? Dr. Bernard will go into much more detail about this, but very roughly, preventing big ships anchoring in the bay, preventing tourist yachts anchoring over the ruins, delimiting the site, showing where the ruins are underwater, and developing both tourism and involvement of local people and students. This, to my mind, is the spirit of research at Pavlopetri. John Henderson in the middle, working with the latest plot from the autonomous underwater vehicle, students, local people from the villages, the local priest, and everybody joining in. It was a wonderful atmosphere. Thank you for listening.
All right, so from the distant past to the current times, and I'd like to tell you a little bit about what's happening on the ground to try to preserve the site. You've heard how important and unique it is, how to make sure it doesn't get demolished carelessly before it can be fully studied and enjoyed. So our organization first got called in here in 2014, and the situation at that time was that the local population could very clearly see that there was illegal anchoring of ships going on in their bay, which is Vatika Bay. They could see from the damage on the beach, they were collecting tar balls and things like that. And they could also physically see the ships. So some mornings they would wake up, and that on the left would be their view. There would be between 5 and a dozen ships, cargo ships anchored there. Now, it's completely illegal. There are regulations that forbid the anchoring of ships there, with the exception of an absolute weather emergency where some ship, it's a life or death matter, and they have to seek shelter in that harbor. That's the only instance in which anchoring there is allowed, but it was being ignored, as you can see, quite flagrantly. Now, the population was not, taking this lying down. They were trying to do what they could about it. There's a very active, you'll see him shortly, editor of a local newspaper. He was writing about this. He was circulating petitions. People were signing them and mailing them in. People were rowing out to the ships to take pictures. Yes, in addition to anchoring there, they were cleaning their hulls. And as I can tell from your reaction, you know what that means. It means dumping ballast, which is water from elsewhere, which can contain all sorts of materials that then contaminate that bay and bring foreign life forms and algae and so on into the bay. And cleaning the hull releases toxic chemicals. That's why it has to be done under very strict conditions in a legal harbor. But it's expensive to do it there. So they had crews sort of doing this illegally for them, and people were rowing out by night to take photos of this to document it, the local citizens. My favorite action that they had, I think this is just genius, is they organized a human chain from the land into the sea, into the submerged city to sort of demonstrate the unbroken chain of history. And so this is the group that was forming on land. And then they created this chain. And then the intrepid ones went into the water. And the really intrepid ones, bottom left, were treading water as far out as they could get above the sea. But all of their efforts were not really bearing fruit at all. They were just being ignored, and this was not getting better. It was getting worse. So they called us in to see if we could come up with some advice for them on what they could do. The powerhouse, the local powerhouse, who cannot be with us today but is with us in spirit on the right, is Barbara, or Varvara, as it is pronounced, I guess, locally. On the left, you have Labi, who is the gentleman from the press there, from the local newspaper. And the second on the right is another member of the arch team, Connie, the local arch team. So our trademark approach at Arch is that we have a very, very extremely interdisciplinary team that includes a lot of political scientists, sociologists, strategists, as well as, of course, archaeologists and historians. We have diplomats, and we kind of try to come up with an action plan when we encounter a situation such as this one. And we start by identifying, well, what are the opportunities and what are the obstacles in a situation. So in Pavlopetri, the big obstacle was that you've seen it on the map. Neapolis is very far away from Athens. Even if it were closer, Athens has a lot of things on its mind just now, and Pavlopetri is not very high on the list. And also Pavlopetri, unique as it is and amazing as it is not very present in people's minds. It's not like a famous site. It's a lot of people then say, "Oh, is it Atlantis?" And that kind of makes it click in their minds. But without an association like that, it's a name most people have never heard. Although we hope that's changing now with being on the list of the World Monument Fund. The opportunities, as we could see them, were, well, it's a very important site. Every scholar, every knowledgeable person in the field agrees that it's a unique and extremely important and valuable site. And the biggest resource we thought was that local civil society was just so engaged and so determined, and they just couldn't be stopped from caring about this. They really felt it very deeply and emotionally and were ready to do a lot. And we operate in many, different places. That's not always the case. So this was something very, very special and very valuable to us there. Another advantage was that, in theory at least, there were these laws and regulations. That's also not always the case. They just weren't being enforced. So the big challenge was to figure out how could we get those laws and regulations to actually be respected. So the first thing that happened was that the local population decided to form a local chapter of Arch. And as you can see, it's not bad to be on the right. It's not bad to be a member of a Greek nonprofit organization. The treats are quite enjoyable. So the plan, that we usually follow, and here too, was to first just get as many facts as possible, and then try to we actually do an actual who's who of who are the enemies of our undertaking, who are our allies, who are the potential allies, and therefore, what are some of the steps that we need to undertake? And what are the vested interests? That's very important too, because it's amazing sometimes what vested interests, either rational or semi-rational, can hide under the surface. And then, of course, the next step is to spread the news and initiate your actions. So one critical advantage, in addition to the already engaged local population, it was super helpful to get on the World Monument list. First of all, it was a huge boost in morale for the local people to get this recognition. There was a great deal of press coverage, and there continues to be. That's been very helpful. And it kind of stimulated, the Greek pride also in this site, which maybe had been a little bit forgotten on the part of some of the authorities and the bureaucrats. So that's been very great. And the other thing that has been helpful is that there's very often an overlay we found with environmental issues when you have a cultural heritage protection issue, because very often the threat to the cultural heritage site is a big economic undertaking. For example, we have a project in Afghanistan where a Chinese mining company was planning to blow up a 5,000-year-old Buddhist city because there was also a copper deposit there. And you could see the stupas. The rest was still buried, and they're going, oh, really? There's an archaeological site? We had no idea. So, and there too, a copper mine, of course, it was also on top of the aquifers, the principal aquifers, so there was a huge environmental issue involved too there. And there's the pollution of the bay issue, there's the water quality issue, which Nick has already highlighted. You can even see it visually and what's happening underwater there. And there are also birds and sea turtles that migrate there and nest there, and all of that is as endangered as the site is. And there's Natura 2000, there's the World Wildlife Fund, there are a number of NGOs there that have become our partners in this effort, which of course is terrific because you have a lot broader spectrum of support then. These are just a little glimpse of some of the press covering that we had as a result of getting on the watch. So there's a lot happening currently too. This is really, as I said, it's really energized the local population. We've got teachers, they've got an essay competition that they're planning on the best essay on how was it to live in Pavlopetri, and they're preparing materials for the tourists. There is a high number of tourists that usually arrive in July and August, and they want to hand out information materials to them to get them on board too. And there's going to be an official watch day. It's usually in September, typically, but they've moved it forward to August in order to have more of the tourists involved in it as well. We still have, a lot of obstacles to face. So there are some locals, some are well connected, who are benefiting from this. Not a lot, but in their terms, I guess it's a lot, which is sad because the little bit that you might profit from selling, snacks to the sailors on those cargo ships is not really in any relationship to what you're losing, but to those individual businessmen, I guess it seems like a lot. We've done a rough calculation, and we figured out that the ship owners are saving at least 5 million euros, and the Greek government is losing at least 5 million euros in harbor fees that they would have to pay if they weren't anchoring illegally, if they had to go to a legal harbor and pay. And, well, it's difficult sometimes to get Greek authorities and even the Greek ministries to pay attention to anything like this because they have the refugee issues, the economic issues, the political issues. So that's definitely a complication. So what are we doing? So one thing we're doing is we're creating a very strong body of evidence. We have a lovely intern named Anne, whose daily task it is to go on a marine app that exists and take a screen capture and document exactly which ships are there. And then she uses the information on that app to look up who owns those ships. So we've got a pretty condemning little file there on the ship owners that are doing what is absolutely not legal. And because we weren't very successful in raising a lot of attention to this in Athens, we thought, well, we're going to have to go over their heads, and we're going to go to the European Union, which also has regulations that Greece is bound to respect in terms of heritage protection and environmental protection. And we have one of the law firms that works for us pro bono has prepared a very thick and impressive dossier, and we're getting ready to submit a complaint to the European Union and also to the United Nations on the violation of the laws and regulations there. And we're also, because that's really the best way forward, we're trying to figure out a compromise that will work. There are other places that those ships can go, and it doesn't have to be on top of this antiquity. And we're also trying to make the case, which really everyone should understand, that there's a big economic gain to everyone if you have a legal tourism attraction, if you have something that you're taking care of, and if you can develop this in a way that will attract more people to an area that does depend on tourism for a lot of its livelihood and jobs. So this is what the app looks like. And we have a couple of Facebook pages, also one in the Greek language in Greece, where it's called Ships Wreck Vatica Bay, and it documents this, and we have people sort of watching that and keeping an eye on it. And it's really a fantastic resource, because if you'd have to research all this independently, you couldn't. So our immediate goals are, so the city, while it's largely underwater, but parts of the archaeology are still on the shore as well. And people are camping there, they're parking their trucks there and their campers there. They're tromping, over that site. They're painting graffiti on it. So what we're hoping to do is build a parking lot. There on the right, you can see the sign that says "Don't camp here" has fallen to a truck already, and the cars are sort of all over the beach, also endangering the marine life and the turtles and the birds and so on. So we want to build a boardwalk, so with signage, so that people can, legitimately walk around and see everything but not damage anything. And then we want to create a parking lot, and ideally an information kiosk too, as Nick already mentioned too. So here's where you can follow our progress and help us out if you feel so inclined. Those are the different websites and the different Facebook pages that we have where we can keep you updated. And if you're interested, there are some brochures over there that talk about the work of Arch in general. Thank you.
Okay, let's see. Are there any questions? Let's go ahead. I may have to repeat your question, but please speak up.
Explain a little more how you found the site originally.
Sorry?
How you found the site originally.
How you found the site.
Okay. It's described in some detail in this book here, Cities in the Sea. But I got permission from the Greek authorities in 1967 to start from the Corinth Canal and go all the way around the Peloponnese looking for underwater sites. I had a truck which I'd converted to carry diving gear. The roads were all dirt tracks. There was a bit of, I don't think you could buy, you couldn't buy petrol, gas south of Sparta. So only tractor fuel. So that I used to go downhill always with the engine switched off. Okay. Of course, that burns the brakes out, but and of course the roads were like that as well. And I had figured out there was a sort of gap. I reread this book recently, and I was quite a bit cleverer than I thought, than I remembered. There are big Bronze Age sites on east and west of the Peloponnese, and almost nothing in the south. And since all the Homeric stories and everything else describes fleets going backwards and forwards and going to Troy and Crete and so on, it's obvious that sites were missing, but that's all we knew. There was a complete gap in the Bronze Age picture. And I can't claim great cleverness, except that I just went along the coast like that until I found it. There it was.
Yes, sir.
What sort of archaeological specimens and items and pottery did you find? I mean, I saw the walls and it looked like a fairly big establishment. But was there treasure?
Sure, can you?
Yeah, the question is about.
That you found.
No, okay. It's very funny, actually, because a sandy beach is usually not a good site for underwater ruins for obvious reasons. The sand usually covers the buildings. I swam out. I realized there were tombs on shore. I swam out along the ridge. It was quite obvious what was going on. You had a rocky ridge, which I would expect to find ruins around one side or the other. There were a couple of underwater tombs on the ridge itself. But again, forgive me, I'd seen many, and it didn't seem to be very significant. Got out to the island itself of Pavlopetri and still effectively had found nothing which I really thought was very important. I then decided to swim straight back from the island to the shore, and then everything happened, because as soon as I was swimming across the middle of the site, I just saw these endless rows. And of course, I didn't really know what they were at that point. I mean, I'd worked on dozens of sites with ashlar blocks. I'd never seen these sort of completely primitive walls on the seafloor and none of them are quite straight. Not very well. Some of the blocks are squared, but very, very few. It was obvious that they were artificial, but they were not, not easy to identify and not recent structures of a classical kind. There was broken pottery all over the seabed, and quite a lot of bones, some human, but although quite a few of the tombs were covered, and obviously people tend to think in a sort of Indiana Jones that if a tomb's got gold in it or something, but over the years most of the tombs have been looted, and I think nobody has found anything at all. They appear to have been infant burials within the houses. The people, if they had a child mortality, they buried the child's body inside the house. So treasures in the sense of sort of gold chains and gorgeous paintings, I'm afraid not.
Yes, in the front.
Yes. Is the Greek government helping you in any possible way?
Sorry, who's
The
helping?
Greek government.
Well, yes, of course. Officially, it would be quite impossible to do that work without official permission. In terms of help, obviously, as Gerald was saying, this is not the right time to ask Athens for a few €100,000. But seriously, there are thousands of sites in Greece which need research and study and excavation. There are dozens of foreign schools, the German School of Archaeology, the American, who are all applying for permits to do this and permits to do that. The Greek government has to be very careful who they license and how many, and to be fair that the different foreign schools get a share of the action, so that when Professor John Henderson, the University of Nottingham, and myself and others put together a project team, we worked with the British School at Athens and then with the Eforet for underwater archaeology, and finally we got the okay, and we worked. That picture I showed you at the end, I would guess half the people in the picture were Greek. So, there's involvement of Greek students, academics, and government agencies. Yes.
Cheryl, would you also like to answer that? You said, that you weren't very successful in engaging the authorities in Athens. Is that something you?
Yeah, it's been.
Could you?
It's been a little bit difficult. For example, we understand when there are no resources available, but the boardwalk is something that the resources would be provided from the outside, and it's been very difficult to even discover who has the authority to approve this. So it seems like there's different mayors who all think that no, that part of it actually belongs to their land area, and so. The bureaucracy has been a bit complicated to deal with, unfortunately.
If I could just add to that, I'm immensely grateful for what Cheryl and ARCH and so on are doing. My job, is just a year or two on the site, measuring things, publishing an academic paper, and then in a certain sense I could just move on and forget it. But there really is a desperate responsibility to keep this site preserved for the next at least another 50 to 100 years before we understand half of it. It's a real responsibility, and as Cheryl's slide showed, it is a legal obligation. The Greek government and the agencies can work with us for a year or two, but the job of really maintaining and protecting it decade after decade requires all the work that they...
And, if, for example, the ministry would instruct the Coast Guard to enforce the law there, then we wouldn't be dealing with this. So it's a little bit frustrating, yes.
Are they being paid off?
That is the supposition, yes.
I was wondering if anything turned up in ancient history, Herodotus talking about any of this.
Well,
Yes. Are there any?
Yeah, I've got it. Thank you. You spoke very clearly. Thank you. No, it's pre-literate in the historical sense. There was writing 2,000, 3,000 years ago, but interestingly, most of it is account books. It's pre-Homer, if you see what I mean. So that Thucydides, Pausanias, all the writing of the classical Greek period, there's no mention of this at all. But there are enough Greek sites enough Bronze Age sites like Phaistos and Knossos and Mycenae and so on, which have been studied, so that we can see where it fits in. But its uniqueness, it's not forgive me, the question about treasures, but I mean, palace sites get all the headlines. And so that Knossos and Phaistos and Mycenae, with kings and gold masks, get all the publicity. The Pavlopetri, I'm trying to think of the equivalent. It's the equivalent of San Diego, if you see what I mean. It's a great, big, scruffy industrial port with military significance, essential supplies, and a big productive hinterland growing oranges and copper and all those things. So it's a fascinating social structure, which is utterly different from the palace sites, and it's different because it's marine. It's part of the earliest marine infrastructure with trade between settlements, Bronze Age settlements all over the Aegean and possibly even North Africa.
Any more questions? Well, seeing none. Oh, go ahead.
Well, just one, and I'm probably far off, but I have visited the ruins that were buried by the volcano in Santorini, and I'm wondering if what you see there relates to what has been found on Santorini. It's really very old also. Are you familiar with the ruins in Santorini?
Can you help, Cheryl?
Do you know the ruins in Santorini?
What's that?
Santorini?
Oh, yeah. Well, okay. The comparisons with Santorini are extremely important, particularly the frescoes and paintings showing ships approaching the port and so on. In that sense, it's a real-life example of what's shown in the painting. So far, so good. But it gets even more interesting simply because Pavlopetri goes back further. In a sense, Pavlopetri confirms what we thought we knew from the paintings, which is a whole area of research in itself, which has to be done. But because Pavlopetri was actually occupied at least 1,000 years before that, possibly 1,500 or 2,000 years, you can start to see the transition from a sort of a fishing village, just huts and people who were competent sailors to go out for a day or whatever, and then the gradual development of that village turning into a town with specialization and services and docks and supplies for ships and shipbuilding and trade and so on and so on. So it's an incredible example of historical and archaeological development. But Santorini is a very important sort of benchmark for comparison. Yes.
Well, I would like to add, if some of you have not planned your summer vacation yet, I can highly recommend Neapolis in August for our watch day, possibly. It's really very lovely. The people, as you can see, are delightful. There are things to see around. It's not just that one town. There are quite a few destinations within an hour or so drive that are very enjoyable. The landscape is great. There are olive groves. There's fruit. There's wild oregano growing everywhere. There's a local honey production that is very charming to see and nice to enjoy. So mark your calendars.
And the heat? How about it?
No, it's not bad. No, and the beaches are clean and very nice, and you can snorkel and look for Pavlopetri.
So with that wonderful invitation, if there aren't any more questions, I would like to thank our speakers again. And thank you all for coming. I hope you will stick around for the reception. All the wine tonight is from the Peloponnese, so if you needed an extra reason to stay, please.
I'm just so excited by what we're doing, Cheryl, really. And it is so important.